All right, we got a great episode coming up for you today. Doug Norrie back by my side, and the topic of conversation is none other than James the Beard Harden, and it's not about the play on the court. Rumors, speculation, tampering. Is Philadelphia all in on trying to pursue James Harden, whether now or in the offseason? Are they overvaluing Ben Simmons and what he would be worth in a trade? And from a Brooklyn Nets perspective, what went wrong to not have James Harden re-up in the offseason along with Kevin Durant? And should the path forward still be re-signing Harden, re-signing Kyrie, and going forward with this big three in pursuit of the championship? We also take a little look over at Paul Millsap and the experiment that never really got a chance to happen in Brooklyn and where he may end up and if there's value for the Brooklyn Nets to acquire as the deadline approaches. It's all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. As always, remind you, thank you for making us your first listen, free on all those great platforms. I'm Adam Armbrecht, covering the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast. He's Doug Norrie, back behind the microphone, owner-operator DFSR for all your daily fantasy sports projections. DraftKings FanDuel, he's got you covered over there. Doug, how are we feeling on a Tuesday? You got a little getaway time. Get away from sports. The Nets lost. There was no interesting action in any other regional or, NFL didn't have anything going on. So just take the night off and enjoy some time.
Yeah, I was joking. Adam and I talk a lot, but I went to a dinner party on Sunday night, and it turned out to be one of the single greatest, with a group of people that just has never watched a sporting event in their entire life, and it just turned into be the greatest night of football specifically, and then the Nets are on, and it was just kind of looked at my wife, and I was like, hey, at least the wine was good because there wasn't much else to do it. No, dude, and then you wake up today and you got James Harden jumping into the news and not for the play, and it's I guess we're going to go through some of this stuff, but you start off the day with, this increase, reporting and speculation about, let me put it this way, a reminder that unlike Kevin Durant, at this point, James Harden is not a net for a long time. Not to say that it can't be, but it's one of those things. It's oh, right, they didn't sign the extension, and there's going to be increased questions about what that means for the team going forward.
Yeah, we'll get into some other maybe potentially conversations around obviously Paul Millsap and where he may land. We know the trade deadline's coming up, but this is it. Off the heels of, this is neither here nor there, but maybe it makes it more interesting that Harden has a rough night against the Timberwolves, doesn't quite look like a quality James the Beard Harden that we've come to know and love. And then we knew at this point as well, and we've talked about it before on the podcast, the most advantageous position for James Harden to be taking is in the offseason, I make the most money. The Nets can give me obviously the biggest bag possible. So there's no reason to be concerned around the fact that he had not been re-signed by the Brooklyn Nets, unless, as you'll fill us in, maybe if, say, Shams came out with a little bit of more news and notes around this idea that things are not as deadlocked in on just wait until the offseason, we'll get this all buttoned up.
Yeah, and I think that's been kind of the understanding among, Nets fans, maybe even the front office too, is that, James, when it's all said and done, James Harden is going to be a net. Now the issue, and I'll get to the Shams thing in 1 second, the issue that comes from this is we kind of thought this was going to happen in the offseason before this season. There was talk, there was a lot of positivity around all three of these guys resigning and just getting it done, and that was just going to be it. Kevin Durant gets it done, so that's easily the most important one. But then Kyrie doesn't, and that one's kind of obvious why, because once all this other stuff around him came up, it makes you have to at least hit the pause button a little bit. But then Harden doesn't resign either, saying that they're just kind of it's mostly positive words, but then they're just going to kind of wait on it and maybe address it next in the off season coming up. Go ahead, and then I can read the
thing. And are you surprised? Because as you said at the time, once the Durant domino fell, we talked about it, was it's only logical that Harden will be the next piece, right? It's just a matter of if not, or when, not if. And Sean Marks talked about the same way as did James Harden. Did you get surprised? Because even back then, Harden did say, listen, I have the opportunity to make the most possible money if I wait until the offseason. That was said at the time And it seemed like they were going to come to an agreement too. So do you find it odd that that did get dialed back somewhat quickly and quietly, almost behind the scenes?
Yeah, I get, and he's right. Like he waits till this contract plays out, and then you can sign a bigger contract on like along the supermax level, I believe. But then Shams comes out today, and it's an article for The Athletic, but I'm just going to read the tweet that he says, and it's related to the 76ers. It says the 76ers prefer to wait to pursue James Harden. I'll get to why this is like sort of problematic, or another superstar in the offseason, and want to save Ben Simmons for that potential deal over current market per sources with knowledge and rival teams. So what this is saying is, this is like Daryl Morey and company for the Sixers, basically throwing in the towel on a Simmons trade for this year because like they're just like evaluating the market and nothing is taking shape. Like people thought it could be the Kings, and that like the Kings basically said, no, we're sticking with De'Aaron Fox, and that's going to be that. And the 76ers have been pretty adamant about, only wanting to get superstar level talent back for Ben Simmons, which feels totally insane, but whatever. They've said that from the beginning. What's so weird about this report is that one, it's like feels like clear tampering on the part of Morey. If these guys if it's like, hey, we want to sign James Harden in the offseason, I just like 99% sure you just cannot say that stuff like in the media because it's like it just sends the signals. Like people have been fined a lot of money for doing stuff like this. Sometimes it's done by accident. This wasn't. And then, but it brings up this whole thing about like, is James Harden going to be a net for the rest of his life? And then when you read stuff like this, it sends out at least the feeling that maybe that is in more doubt than Nets fans maybe had thought about prior to, even prior to this coming out. So I think there's a couple of different things to discuss, but like, what was your first feeling when you saw this? Because they could have mentioned a lot of other guys here and they just use Harden's name specifically and then say, or other superstars, right? But his name is clearly one of the ones that's brought up. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's other guys out there. I mean, we know that there's the connection between Daryl Morey and James Harden, obviously going back to Houston. So you understand why they're specifically maybe taking a look at him. And to your point, usually, and then this came out today. So maybe the next couple of days, we'll hear that the NBA is finding the 76ers some amount of money because this does very much feel like one of those things you're not allowed to just basically communicate to the league at large and say, no, we're not doing anything except for this one player, and we're waiting for that. And the other piece is, too, while negotiations go on in the background, if you're the 76ers, this is also sending a message by saying what anyone that's going to want to come after Ben Simmons is going to need to unload the truck. And listen, anyone that has called or asked them is obviously going to get that information. But it does strike me as a clear, hey, don't bother. Don't bother if you're anybody looking for Ben Simmons because there's only one guy that we're really looking for. Now, that piece of it, I kind of don't care. I don't care about what Daryl Morey is up to. That piece of it's fine. They can find them, do whatever they want. The other side of it, where there has to then be some level of speculation that the commitment of James Harden to the current situation in Brooklyn is not as ironclad as we thought it was, where he's in Houston. He wants to get a chance to win a chip. This feels like a great opportunity to do so. And now it almost feels like this is going to be a potential pit stop for him en route to, one, making a ton of money, but also maybe getting back with the GM of his choosing, or maybe in a circumstance where his role and his opportunity, even we know Embiid is obviously there, is maybe a little bit stronger. So I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg of the experience that he's had now since coming to Brooklyn versus where his mindset was of first wanting to get out of Houston and then figure it out after the fact.
Yeah, like I would be, so I have a bunch of different thoughts of it, like from like a sort of a logistical standpoint on this, and then like a Harden level thing. I'll start it by saying I'd be kind of floored if he wasn't a Brooklyn Net next year. Like I think that this opportunity and the and just like what this team represents, and specifically having Durant, because like if you have championship level aspirations, there's almost like no one better to play with than Durant, right? So I think just even from that standpoint, this is where the Durant thing is always going to be so important that he re-signed, because if you want to win a championship, that this is among the very small group of guys that you can just look at him and say, hey, it kind of doesn't, well, it matters, but like it matters a lot less about how everything else is built when Kevin Durant's on this team. So I think like even to start there, I would say, like, I'd be kind of shocked if it didn't happen. I have a couple other things that are kind of in line with like why I don't think this part of it makes sense. We'll get to that in a second. First, Going to talk to you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best NBA DFS prop game on the market. It's not even close. If you try to go these other prop operators, sometimes it's super hard to find where the props are. They're laid out in a way that makes it sort of impossible to even know, if you're going to different games and stuff like that, you can't even find what you want. Not on Prize Picks. It's laid out really simply. They have every prop for players, starters, bench guys, every stat you can think of too, like points, rebounds, assists. You can jump in on all of them, and all you do on Prize Picks is it's you versus the numbers, and that's it. You want to go over, under on any of these things, and Prize Picks has it laid out for you, so you can do that. You pile together 2 to 5 different plays. You can win up to 10x on an entry. Like I said, just you versus the numbers. Prize Picks has dialed in on the props, and they made it so that you're going to want to. Also, if you go to prizepicks.com or you download the app, all users that deposit using the promo code NBA, that's easy to remember, your favorite sport, NBA, will get $50 free if your first Prize Pick entry scores a single point. Just got to score a single point. They're making it easy. They're basically giving you that $50 if you use the promo code NBA. Make sure that you're using promo code NBA at prizepicks.com. Go to Prize Picks right now. Download the app, sign up, use the promo code NBA. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy.
And by the way, guys, we're talking about trades whenever they may happen for the Brooklyn Nets or other teams around the league. You've made us, the Brooklyn Nets, the Locked On Nets podcast, your first listen of the day. The trade deadline is going to be Thursday, February 10th at 3 p.m. And the Locked On NBA podcast is going to be covering it live from 2 to 4 p.m. You're going to have Kim Becker, John Carolus, Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd, and NBA veteran Antonio Daniels, which will give all that analysis from all the local experts on any of the big deals that go down. Subscribe to the Locked On NBA YouTube channel right now and turn on those notifications so you don't miss out on the action. Back into some trade speculation conversation. I would agree. I would tend to agree with you that it's more than likely that James Harden is on the Brooklyn Nets next year for the exact reason you talk about. It's Kevin Durant, and that locks it in. One thing before you get to, you said you had a couple more points on that area. The interesting thing specifically when you talk about the Philadelphia 76ers, just from, say, an injury or health standpoint, if you're James Harden or any superstar and you're thinking about where do I want to team up, well, maybe you look at Kevin Durant and go, well, he's had some injuries. You're also talking potentially about going to the 76ers where Embiid has had injuries. So you can take that piece of it maybe off the table, so to speak, if you're thinking in Harden's mind, well, I also want the team that's most likely to be there, be healthy and capable of winning it. The 76ers have had their own concerns, especially around their biggest star, Embiid.
Yeah. So, and the other thing with them is so besides just this championship aspirations and whether you rather play with Embiid or Morey, you trust the front office, and all that is just total speculation. The other part here is that the Nets so Harden can opt in to a player option after this season. And then he can sign a 4-year contract after that, or he could just opt out and then sign the contract now. The Sixers would not have the ability to sign him to one of these max contracts. He'd have to take a major discount because I think that they'd be so far into the tax that the only way they could do it would be through a sign and trade. And if you do it through a sign and that's what they're sort of referencing with Simmons. It's you would have to pile Simmons's money together as part of the sign and trade. What world would the Nets do that? I just you know what I mean? I just don't it's
well, that's the piece where I think that
trade
the
him
Nets
in
have the
conference.
control.
Trade him in conference to a rival that you're going to see many times a year, that you're going to competing for the Eastern Conference, and sort of facilitate a way to make that happen so you get some value in return. I just don't see a world where the Nets would have any appetite to do something like that. And that's the other part where this starts to fall down. This is why I think these floating out of names like this is kind of just insane behavior frankly for Ben Simmons. After everything you know about Ben Simmons at this point, what world are you getting back these superstar level players for him? Around a guy, he's a good player. Don't get me wrong about that. Great defender, has never shot a 3 in his life, basically. He has definite, he's going to sit out this whole season. I would say there's some risk around not being happy in a situation and not wanting to play. There's all this other stuff. I just don't understand. It just seems totally illogical to think that the Nets, even if you got to this point, which I don't think they're going to, it seems nuts to think that the Nets would be yeah, I guess this is where we got to go. I don't see there's any world where they would do that. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, so I'll say there is a world where it would make sense in the version of it that the 76ers accept that the value that they're placing on Ben Simmons is not where the league is telling you his value is, right? So in the version of it where let's just say they get to the offseason, let's not even worry about right now, speculating ahead of the deadline or something. If you're in the offseason and the 76ers back off of this idea that, well, we want to trade Ben Simmons, and if we were going to do it somewhere else, it would take an absolutely mind-blowing deal in order to make that happen. If you come back from that and you acknowledge that James Harden clearly has a much stronger track record, obviously Simmons is younger, but Harden has been the more proven commodity and is the player that you want to pursue and that you're after. I think that you have to then consider that the Nets would be reducing their cap in taking on Ben Simmons' contract because the numbers are significantly lower. It's not, that's not even a joke. It's going to be $15 to $20 million underneath that if Harden's going to sign a $50 million a year contract potentially. So you would be bringing it down, and the Nets would be able to pursue another player to bring into that team. Or the other scenario, I think, is probably where, as we've seen before, multiple teams get involved, and the Nets maybe they don't care about having Ben Simmons. And maybe it's Ben Simmons landing somewhere else, and the Nets getting other pieces and other assets back. That can also be a version of it. Now, again, I don't know how much of the likelihood I would put on that, and if the Nets would really want to get into that conversation, to your point, sending Harden to a competitor in the Eastern Conference, unless you're really seeing player movement from a third team or a version coming out of Philadelphia that you feel like does satisfy your needs coming back and still puts you at a very high level to compete for a championship. All things being equal, if you're still going to have Kevin Durant and you think you're going to have Kyrie Irving, there is worlds where you're still a high level, obviously competitive team, and you're probably still maybe the odds on betting favorite to win the championship. And it's incredibly difficult for these things to get facilitated. Not that they haven't happened, not that it's not possible, but I would wonder who the other teams become. And we talked about this on other episodes around, this is where the Houston Rockets get involved. This is where OKC gets involved because they're a dumping ground for contracts. I think you would have to look around. There was some low level. Sacramento Kings was one team. The Hawks was another one. Collins said that he wanted out of there. Is there a version of things where the Nets end up with Collins and other pieces from other places, etc.? Maybe, or at least clearing enough cap to be able to add then another guy. That's something I could see happening. But it still all starts on the premise that Harden doesn't want to be here, doesn't want to get paid the most possible money and compete with Kyrie and Kevin Durant for championships.
And that's where I think we just probably took the long road to get to the pretty simple answer. In Occam's, I guess not totally Occam's razor here, but the simplest answer is usually the correct one. The simplest answer is he just waited another year so he could just get paid more, and then that's the end of it, and he's just going to be with a net, and all this other stuff is smokescreen. But the reason we talk about it is because it's so specific around a guy that's on the team right now that you have to talk about it, because it's as a reminder to say, hey, it's just right now. Sometimes we think of these guys as Nets for life, and because they're on the team now. And while that's, like I said, the case with Durant, it's just not that way with Harden right now. And it's just a reminder that for even all these other things that are going to happen this season, maybe we get to the end and sort of how it ends is maybe it ends up being the most important thing too. Right? Because you win the championship and all of a sudden it's a lot easier to stomach it.
Right.
You get to the playoffs and Kyrie doesn't play half the games, and whatever, and you lose or something like that crazy happens, or I don't know, play it out some other way, and now it doesn't look as inviting to come back. So I think that's where you have to wait too. Is just what happens at the end? How does this finish off? Because sometimes the last feeling is the correct feeling.
So very quickly then, do you think that, let's say that the Nets get healthy and they win the championship this year, does that make it more or less likely that the Nets would be willing to move off of Harden, or that he would be willing to move on? Is that all relative? Because I guess from Harden's standpoint, you probably, if you really want to win a championship, that checks the box, and then you get to make the most money and stay in Brooklyn. So who cares? You're satisfied. Whereas for the Nets, if you win the championship and then could also get younger and adjust some numbers, would that be appetizing to Sean Marks in Brooklyn to say, thanks so much for the chip, as long as it passes the Kevin Durant test, we're okay to now restructure this thing and maybe get younger and pursue another chip with our superstars?
Now, I think you when you have a guy like Harden on this team, even if he's not the James Harden from 3 or 4 years ago, you just need to kind of ride it out. I think that and if you sign a contract that looks bad in year 4, the windows are all now, and he's still part of the window. He's still clearly is at a level where he can play championship level basketball. Maybe he's not the best player on the team on a championship, he's not at that level, but I think it'd be hard to reconstruct the talent level around him like on him out the door. So I think you ride this. I'll be honest with you, it'd be kind of a disaster. Like if he didn't resign here after the trade, like that is, I know will have gotten 2 seasons out of him, but I think you'd have to look at that as nothing short of like unless you just win and they leave. But like otherwise, it feels like an unmitigated disaster for him not to be on the Nets long term, even though they still clearly won the trade on what they sent out. But like that, the plan had to be, we're going to bring him in here and he'll continue to be on the Nets. Like there's no, like this wasn't looked at as like a rental, I don't think.
No, of course. Tell everybody about Bet Online. Then I have one more thought before we also cover one other potential moving piece for the Brooklyn Nets before the deadline.
Yeah, no problem. Bet Online would like to wish you a happy new betting year. Continue our march toward the NBA playoffs as we actually really getting toward the All-Star break first. NFL playoffs just coming off that masterful weekend that most other people got to watch, not me. Bet Online remains the number one spot for all the best sports wagering action for 2022 and beyond. It's a new year. They have a new updated desktop and mobile website. You sign up today on Bet Online. You're going to get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Got to use the promo code Locked On, just like our podcast network. Football, basketball, hockey, boxing, UFC. It was a big fight weekend this weekend. UFC, right over to your favorite Vegas casino games. Take advantage of all the amazing offers on Bet Online for 2022. Bet Online, the fastest and easiest way to wager on all of your favorite sports. Bet Online, where the game starts.
So as we say, then my only last thing I think on the James Harden piece, just to what you said there, that I agree with you that it would feel like well, I don't know, because you and I have said before that you make that move 9,000 times out of 9,000 to get James Harden, to have Kyrie, to have Kevin Durant, to do what it takes to create this team to go for the championship. Now, is the expectation that you're going to win a championship? Yes. But I disagree a little bit in the sense that if you felt like by the end of this year, whatever version you've seen of James Harden is some slightly diminished version of him, and you see the writing on the wall, I could make the argument, depending on what you accomplished in the offseason, that would be another very forward-thinking move by the Brooklyn Nets to say, if we don't think this is going to be the answer after 2 years, let's get out ahead of it and find a way to keep our Kevin Durant and potentially Kyrie Irving window open longer, as opposed to ride it out. I understand you take this as far as you can, but because of the injuries we've seen with all these guys, and Harden fell into that last year as well, maybe there is some world where by the way, if the Nets are 100% healthy and Harden looks disastrous in the playoffs, and highly unlikely thing, right? But if that were to be the case and he was not the player that you expected him to be to help you win a championship, then I think it'd be a smart thing to try to pivot and get off of it before you find yourself with a 35-year-old Harden looking like he's no longer going to be able to help you get that championship. But that's for another day. I guess we can leave it there for now, because we're not going to solve all of the Nets problems in one episode. The other guy that already came out was Paul Millsap. The understanding that the Nets and he have mutually decided to try to find him another place to go, because the role that he's had in Brooklyn has not been the expectations that he certainly had when he signed in the offseason. Do you think that it's one of two things? I went and looked at his stats this year on very low minutes. In theory, if you gave him more minutes on another team, the numbers would look a little bit even better than they did over the last couple of years for him with the Nuggets, 20 and 24 minutes. He's only been playing 11 for the Nets. Do you think there's any team that has an appetite for him and that looks at it and just says, oh, it was a numbers game in Brooklyn, versus how we kind of saw it as, is this guy just done? And there's not necessarily a lot of value, even at $2.6 million.
So hard to tell. We've seen so little of him this year that it's like it's just hard to know exactly what the reality is with him. I mean, the Nets clearly see enough with him that like they're not having it. And early on in the season with him, it kind of just looked bad. Now, I thought a lot of that stuff was just sort of fluky, frankly. Like there was just some bad looking shots. Like it looked like it's just a guy who hadn't played a lot. Like he was just kind of like ramping up, and like he just looked a little sloppy. It wasn't necessarily like he got bad at basketball overnight, but it was just all this. It was like this weird sloppy stuff, and it was usually sort of high profile, like dropping the ball into the basket, and like there was a few things that happened like that. So I think like that kind of got him off to a bad start. Obviously, he was in and out with personal reasons a bunch. And even like when he started playing, like the role and the playing time was so sporadic, that'd be hard for anybody to kind of ramp up and just like get into a good flow when you're coming in, for such short stretches. I'll stop short of saying that like they didn't give him a fair shake, because it's not like he did a ton of great stuff in his limited time. I early on the season, I was like pretty impressed with where he was defensively, especially on switching stuff. There's a few games going back and watching the tape that I was like, oh yeah, he definitely still has a role here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just a very weird situation. I'm sure another team would look at it and say, we'll give it a try. If he's going for a trade, they're not going to give the Nets back any assets for it. Like you're not going to get anything
I'm not
back.
saying anything crazy, but a couple of first rounders I think is reasonable to put out there. Right?
Yeah, but like, I mean, I'm just looking up. Like it's just like I don't know. It just like never kind of came together, and
Well, you know what?
I do feel a little bad for him in this respect because I just don't know like what he was supposed to do in this situation where, yeah, he looks okay. So for instance, he played 127 minutes with Harden this year, which really isn't that much. Those numbers, by the way, when they're together, it's only 2 man, so there's lots of other stuff that can happen here. But like it was like a plus 11.5 net rating. Again, not many minutes and whatever. You can get pretty fluky in there. I mean, conversely, his minutes with just him and Kevin Durant were like losing minutes, like so -7. So like I don't know how much we can take it, but what we can take is to say 220 total minutes between playing with the best players is like not probably enough to truly know what he was going to do. And I think that's more of what it was. We just never, it just kind of like, it just like stalled out in the tarmac. Like, I just don't know. It just never got going in a way. And I'm sure like every time he didn't play, it was more and more frustration. You feel like looking back now, all this personal stuff is probably kind of related to this, right? Like just being
right. I personally don't like not playing.
I mean, that's speculation. So whatever. Yeah. He missed a lot of stuff, and it doesn't seem like he's been happy. So I'm not like totally shocked that it kind of ended like this.
And I think too, like, it's funny. There's another guy in Blake Griffin that's been on the Brooklyn Nets, and we've talked about what he's looked like, good or bad, but he was here last year and he kind of established what, his value to this team. And in a funny way, we said it before, or at least I've looked at it and said, remember, when you're missing Joe Harris and then you don't have Kyrie Irving to start the year, some of these guys that have these very niche roles, and specifically ones that are more defensive minded, it's kind of hard to evaluate what their big picture value is because you don't have the complete complement. Normally you're thinking, well, Blake Griffin, you'll be out there with Kevin Durant and James Harden and Kyrie, or two of the three, and Harris will be on the wing, and all the spacing will be there, and everything that you do is going to be that much easier and more effective for you, and we can value what you do at a much higher level. For Paul Millsap, even though he got to play, as you said, with Harden and with Durant in relatively small minutes, and that's by choice, I also wonder if Steve Nash and the Nets, just from a rotation standpoint, once you lose Harris and then you don't have Kyrie to start the season, all of a sudden you start looking at everything a little bit different and saying, well, we need to make sure we have more offensive value. We're going to overuse Patty Mills more than we anticipated. We're going to try to ramp up LaMarcus Aldridge. And these defensive value guys, Bruce Brown falls in this category too. All of a sudden, hey, your role just doesn't look the same as we anticipated it literally the second before the season started. And if you're Millsap, once you don't get the look, that can kind of put the writing on the wall for you. At 2.6 million. I'll throw in like a Javon Carter into this. He makes a little like 3.5. Is there any world where the Nets like can lump those things together and just get some other guy for 2 or 3 million? Maybe just clean up a little bit of cap or something and get a couple of just bodies off the roster that really aren't serving much of a function right now?
You'd have to send out some draft picks for sure. Maybe like don't need to be huge picks, but like the Nets and the Nets cover is getting kind of bare with that too. Like the Harden, they have some picks out there, but they don't have tons with the Harden trade.
The numbers are big enough, you think, that they need to add a pick to it? Like, I mean, give me a low-level veteran that's signed basically for nothing contract somewhere else and say, I'll take your 3 million, you take 5.5, let's all have a good day.
I just don't know why why would the other team do it? It was just, it's all case specific. I'm not trying to slough this off, but it's like, no one that's like playing real rotation minutes is going to do that just to get like some flotsam back from, you know what I mean? Like some spare parts back.
Just do us a solid. Why don't you? The other thing is too, by the way, he wants to be playing more. He doesn't want to, like, it's the 16th year. He doesn't want to be diminished. The hard part is that if all he wants to do is play more, well, then you can look at low-level teams and say, hey, we'll drop you off on a bad team that is willing to insert you potentially, although they tend to play a lot of young guys, or competitive teams that, it's like there's probably this really finite selection of opportunities where a team goes, oh, I look at this guy and think that he really does give us an opportunity to play him 15, 20 minutes a night and give us real value. And that's the hard part. I think we talked about before about the Nets being a good organization from the standpoint of, Spencer Dinwiddie trying to find a way to get him to a spot that he wanted to be in. I think they're going to do their best to accomplish that here. I would assume it's a Western Conference team, not that they're overly concerned about, Millsap coming back to haunt them. But to your point, It's only 2.6 million, but you got to give me a team that has a glaring hole or need or suffers an injury of some kind over the next 7 to 10 days that tells you they could really insert and utilize him in that way. Otherwise, you could trade him somewhere and that team could end up just cutting ties with him within the first 2 weeks if it doesn't look good too. So it's a rough spot.
Well, this is where like the Nets like may have done themselves a little, well, maybe it's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't, because he played so little and it was kind of didn't look all that great when he did it. Like this is where it's not like you can just shop him around with all this great hope, right? Like you weren't playing him. So it's like you can't, it's not like you call our teams to be like, hey, we weren't playing him, but man, it looked really good. Like it's just not, it just doesn't work that way. He would have been playing more. So I just think it was just one of these unfortunate situations. It seemed great on paper when they did it. We all liked the signing a ton and it just hasn't worked out in any way. I think there's other context behind this besides just, bad basketball or whatever. And so, like I said early, I think it was stalled kind of out of the gate. But then it really just never got any sure footing and then it was kind of just done. Right. And so I think that it's just an unfortunate situation. All right, we're going to get out of here. Quick reminder, Adam and I will be at the Laker game. So hit us up on Twitter. Your handles are both on YouTube right now, or it's just at Doug Norrie, at Adam Armbrecht. If you're going to be at the game too, love to just, wave hi to somebody if you listen. So we'll be sitting there at the Lakers game. And make sure you sign up for the YouTube channel. Over 900 subscribers right now, pushing toward 1,000. I'll put that link in the show notes. Like and subscribe to the Locked On Nets YouTube.
Listen, a lot of people trying to make moves, a lot of speculation, a lot of information, but I'll tell you this right now. Whenever a man does a thoroughly stupid thing, it is always from the noblest of motives. Oscar Wilde.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.